Okay, so we're going to do a practice free response question today. And this is one of those questions that I feel like looks really difficult at first and is sort of intimidating, but it's actually not. It's pretty easy if we break it down. So this is from the 2009 exam, and you guys can see that it has to do with banking. It's one of the short FRQs. It says, assume that the reserve requirement is 20% and banks hold no excess reserves. So if you guys are recalling, the reserve requirement is important because it reminds us of something called the money multiplier, which we'll need to do for this question. It says, assume that Kim deposits $100 of cash from her pocket into the checking account. That's a really important detail because $100 in cash in her pocket is considered the same as $100 in a checking account. They are both considered part of the M1 money supply. Calculate each of the following. So we have 3 points here up for grabs with tasks 1, 2, and 3. So it says the maximum dollar amount that the commercial bank can initially lend. So if I hop over here and draw for us, the amount of money that they can lend from the initial deposit has to do with the fact that she deposits $100, okay? And with $100, the reserve requirement is 20%. So that means that the bank can only initially lend 80% of that money. So the answer to part 1 is $80 because that is 80% of the initial deposit. If we go back to the question, the next part is the maximum total change in demand deposits in the banking system. The key phrase here is demand deposits in the banking system. If you recall, when we have a bank's balance sheet, let me just see here. When we have a bank's balance sheet, it is separated into two sides. There are assets and there are liabilities. In the liabilities, we have demand deposits, and demand deposits are all the things that regular people are depositing in the bank. So if she deposits $100, how is that going to expand the demand deposits in the banking system? So what you do is you take the $100 that she deposits and you multiply it by the money multiplier. Well, what is the money multiplier? You need to remember this formula. It's 1 over the reserve requirement. So it's 1 over 20%. So 1 over 20% is the same as 1 over 0.2. 1 over 0.2 is the same as 1 over 2/10. 1 over 2/10 is the same as 1 over 1/5. And then if you recall, when you divide fractions, you simply multiply by the reciprocal, which that would be 1 times 5 over 1, which equals 5. Now, some of you, this might have been, this step that I'm going through right here, might have been, too easy for you, and you clearly knew right away that 1 over 20% is 5. But for some people, you may not know that, so I wanted to make sure I walk through that step. So now we're going to take this $100 and multiply it by 5. So the answer to part 2 is $500. The next part of the question is one of those parts where I feel like the College Board is trying to determine, do you know how the reserve requirement and the money supply and what is part of the money supply and does a deposit affect the money supply? They want to know that you know that $100 from cash is the same as it being in her checking account. So if $500 is going to go into the banking system as a result of this deposit by way of the money multiplier, remember, it doesn't say that it's going to, it's the maximum potential. Okay? So how is it going to change the money supply? Well, if $100 was already in the money supply, then that means out of this $500, only $400 of that $500 is new. So let me just get back to my pen here. So $500 is new money. 100 of it was the old money. So the answer to part 3 is $400. You actually can do that a couple of ways. So I'm going to erase this stuff right here because I need a little bit of space. There's 2 ways that you could do that. the first way that you could do that is you could use the information from part 2 and simply subtract the $100. Okay? Or you could take a multi-step process to get there. So let me just put $500 back down for part 2, and now we're doing part 3. So again, you could take the $500, just subtract the 100 because you know it's already in the money supply, and write 400. But let's say you didn't know how to do that. So we took the money supply and we said that $80 of that is actually going to be lent out from the initial deposit. If you take that $80 and you multiply it by the money multiplier, which was 5 if you recall, 80 times 5 equals $400. And that's another way to get to that question. So then, where does that $100 come from? Remember, 20% of that $100 had to be left behind. So $20 times the money multiplier equals $100. And if you add those both together, you get that total that went into the banking system. So you kind of have to think to yourself that the reserve requirement is going to retain the original money that was already in the money supply. Okay, so the answers to this are part 1, 2, and 3, 100, 500, 400. Now the question gets a little bit more complicated. It says, assume that the Federal Reserve buys $5 million in government bonds in the open market. As a result of the open market purchase, calculate the maximum increase in the money supply in the banking system. Here's a little interesting fun fact. When the Federal Reserve buys $5 million in government bonds on the open market, 100% of that money goes into the banking system. However, if this question had said that they purchased the bonds from the public and not the open market implies from banks. If that had said from banks, then that means that only the percentage that was left over after taking out the required reserves would expand in the money supply. So we have $5 million worth of bonds being purchased on the open market from banks. Therefore, this is part B, correct? I just want to label it correctly for you guys. So therefore, the money multiplier times the 5 million equals 25 million is the answer. Now it says part C, given the increase in the money supply from part B, what happens to real wages in the short run? Explain. All right, so this is interesting. Real wages. What graph did we study where we even can begin to discuss real wages? Okay, so what happens is now we know that there is $25 million worth of money in the money supply that wasn't there before. So now what you have to do is you have to visualize the money market graph. You have to say to yourself, okay, what is $25 million going to do? So if we push the money market graph to the right, remember this is money supply. I'm not going to put all the labels on here in the interest of time. What this injection of $25 million has done is it has lowered interest rates. Why do we care about interest rates? Because lower interest rates affects another graph that we know. Let me go back to the question. It says in the short run. So I don't really need to worry about long run aggregate supply, nor do I need to worry about a short run aggregate supply shift that's a result of this when the economy finds a new long run equilibrium. I don't need to do that. All I need to do is figure out what happens in the short run. Well, my money market graph told me that interest rates decrease. So what's going to happen over here? Interest sensitive consumption is going to increase as a result. Therefore, I'm going to see a higher GDP, which is lovely, but also due to higher aggregate demand, because remember, interest sensitive consumption, that means that C and IG are going to increase as a result of lower interest rates. So now price level has risen. So the question is, what has happened to real wages? Real wages have not are going to be affected because of the higher price level. You guys should remember that nominal wages are sticky in the short run. They do not change. However, price level has gone up. So let's say I was making $10 an hour. I'm still making $10 an hour because nominal wages are sticky in the short run, but price level is up, let's say 10%. So if prices are up 10%, that means I'm really earning now 10 cents or a dollar less than this rather. I'm going to be earning $9 an hour. So my real wages are actually lower than they were prior to this. So the answer to part C is real wages have declined due to, oops, I'm losing my pen, due to higher price level. So now let's head on over to that rubric. You'll notice that we've got 80, 500, and 400. We have 1 point is earning that the money supply will increase by 25 million. 1 point is just saying for the real wages will fall, so that's pretty key. And then lastly, it will fall because the Federal Reserve's actions cause inflation. We just showed that price level increased with our graph. So as long as you're explaining, PowerPoint doesn't seem to be responding right now, but you can see the shadow of what we did over here. As long as you explain price levels increased, and if you want to call that inflation, that's fine. But for the most part, this is an easy question if you understand the rules concerning the money multiplier and how the money multiplier affects both deposits and bond purchases. And lastly, if you recall how increasing the money supply will affect things like price level, which affects wages. I feel like sometimes people would look at this and say, well, how do I know what happens to wages? None of this stuff has to do with wages. Understanding the connection and taking a moment to draw a little baby graph on the side of your piece of paper is pretty key. And that will help you get a 6 out of 6 on a question like this. Until next time.